It's really interesting because tonight I want to talk. So, the first class we talked about swimming against cultural currents, how the world is moving in a direction that to many of us does, I mean, I think probably to almost everybody, doesn't seem uh, conducive to progress, however you define that. Um, and so, one of the things that we were talking about in the first class was the way that our culture does not encourage introspection, does not encourage slowing down, paying attention to your own experience, invites you to be distracted and consume and find enemies in the outer world and express your opinions about them and all of that. That's what our culture seems to be moving toward. And then in the second class, we talked about how mindfulness practice allows you to notice what your mind is doing, allows you to learn how to direct and sustain your attention, and notice when you aren't directing and when your attention is flying out the window or getting caught up in um, some kind of controversy or whatever. The more you practice mindfulness, the more quickly you will notice when you are caught by a thought, caught by an emotion, caught by the karmic momentum of the situation in which you find yourself. So the more quickly you notice, the more quickly you have the freedom to choose whether that's how you want to continue to be in that situation or not. Does all of that make sense? That's the ground for tonight's talk. And so tonight's talk is about facing reality and about how we can skillfully work with it. And so the first thing we have to know about facing reality is that there's a difference between what's actually going on and what we think about it. So for many of us, it takes a while of practicing before we begin to realize that our thoughts don't accurately reflect what's going on. We begin to notice that because we begin to realize that our thoughts are very fickle. And one day we'll be full of thoughts about how terrible a situation is, and the next day we'll be filled with happiness and joy. And the next day we'll be filled with strategies about how to work with things. And we start to notice that our minds are very fickle and changeable, but we also start to notice that the awareness that sees all of that changeable quality of mind is constant. So because of that constancy of awareness, we are able to begin to accurately discern reality. To accurately discern reality, we have to realize that there's that difference between what's actually going on and what we think about it depends upon our recognizing that our storylines and our opinions keep us caught in that circle. Our storylines and opinions keep us caught. And then we begin to, this is a huge breakthrough. It sounds so obvious, but then we begin to realize that everybody's like that. Everybody's thoughts, everybody's storylines, everybody's opinions, those are keeping everybody else caught up in their perspective. And so on the planet now, we have somewhere in excess of 7 billion different perspectives going on all the time. And obviously, some of them are not helpful to the well-being of people on the planet. So how do we make our perspective align with what will bring benefit in the world? That's really the fundamental question. And I think the first thing that we have to do is stop cherishing our storylines and opinions. That's my story and I'm sticking to it. How many times have we heard that, thought that, found ourselves doing that? That person is a jerk. I know, I can tell you chapter and verse of all their jerkiness. Whatever it may be, it doesn't matter what story it is. I have We all have, in our families, in our workplaces, in our encounters, just driving down the street and seeing people behaving in the ways that people behave. We have our opinions about all of that. So for those of you who've read my book, this is in the book, so I apologize because it's kind of crude, but I'm going to say it again because it really helped me once I realized it. Opinions. It's really interesting that there's so much. Opinions are so powerful. Opinion polls. 79% of the American public, blah, 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 whatever it is. Opinions are like farts. Everybody has them. Everybody likes their own better than anybody else's. And mostly, they're just a lot of hot air. But we really think ours. So the Buddhists have a way of talking about this. It's called relative reference point. This is a huge breakthrough of insight to realize that your reference point is relative, and so is everybody else's. So you cannot, from the point of view of your relative reference point, you cannot understand the whole picture. Does that make sense? The picture's way too big. No one single relative reference point can embrace the whole picture. All we can do is be willing to fully inhabit the awareness that underlies our particular relative reference point. So that becomes a more ultimate reference point, which is simply the awareness that is there when you stop cherishing opinions and holding on to storylines. And that is what enables you to see reality, to see the difference between what you think about things and what's actually happening. Stop me if anything I'm saying doesn't make sense. Lisa. Wait just a minute. Let's hand you a mic.
So everyone's reference point is relative, in that from that perspective we can't see the whole picture, but that we can see it through this ultimate, through the ultimate reference point. That's when I
Well, it's not exactly, ultimate is not exactly a reference point. The ultimate is the awareness that underlies, everybody has it, you know, whether you call it Buddha nature or natural wakefulness or basic goodness, it underlies everyone's relative reference point. And so therefore, it is a more ultimate or more fundamental ground of awareness. But mostly, in most of us, it gets hijacked, that quality of basic attentiveness gets hijacked by the storylines and the opinions, and those form a filter that prevents us from seeing what's going on. Is that helpful? Good. Okay, so facing reality requires that we recognize these tendencies to create our own personal cocoon of interpretation and decide to instead begin to deconstruct that and open ourselves to the simple awareness, the simple presence of being here. Does that make sense? No? Yes?
Yeah. I guess I'm thinking that what is real, we all come with our perception. So we can recognize that is true. And it's, to me, it's all about ego, right? Because I'm looking out of my body.
Yep.
But we're all doing that. So what are we left with? I can't then claim to know reality.
Right. Well, actually, so I'm in the There are 3 parts to tonight's talk, and I'm at the very last part of the first one, and the next word is cherishing opinions and storylines equals ego. So, like I said, yeah. So that is what. So when we stop cherishing our opinions, when we start to realize, I had an experience yesterday where I got very upset, and when we get upset, we generally, ego, shall we say, the way that we like to look at ourselves, the way we like to see and think of ourselves, generally tries to figure out how we're right, we're justified, there was a reason why we did that, and it was okay, and the other person or whatever situation there was. So I noticed that arising in myself, and then I thought, what other way can I look at this? And um, and I'm gonna talk more about that now, because the next section of my 3 sections is dealing with reality properly. And part of that is to be open to messages from the phenomenal world. So when something happens and you suddenly find yourself challenged, as I did yesterday, you can crawl back into your cocoon and, batten down the hatches and tell yourself a story about it, or you can ask yourself, what message is there in this for me? How can I look at this in some way that might invite insight as opposed to further solidification? And so that's really all it is. It's not like there's some ultimate fundamental reality that we're going to tune into and then we'll be without ego. It's that we're always willing to explore the possibility that our reactions to the phenomenal world can obscure the messages that the world is trying to give us. Does that make sense? So that, yes.
I guess I'm not seeing then the difference between the reactive story that we're telling ourselves and the stepping out of that and this new story that we're telling ourselves. Because ultimately, any messages that we're perceiving, anything that we're experiencing, is another story that we're telling ourselves. It is not something that is, as you said, there is no absolute truth in reality. So I guess, what's the difference then of telling yourself one story versus another?
Well, I would suggest that it's not necessarily imperative that the next moment becomes a storyline. I think the story Danae told us is an example of, she was just sitting there, and then this insight arose, this thought arose in her mind, you need to be brave. And so, yeah, you could spin a storyline around needing to be brave, or you could just simply take that in as a bit of information from the world. It has to do with how solid you get about things. If you withdraw and centralize and solidify, you can feel it. You start to feel tight. I mean, literally, in your body, you start to feel tight. Now, many of us can't tell because we've lived with anxiety for so long. That makes us feel tight. And so, but as you begin to trust that it's possible to relax into your basic awareness, then some kind of relaxation occurs that allows you to be able to discern the difference between the storylines you're spinning and the insight, that small voice that you hear when you stop spinning the story. Does that make any sense to you?
I guess I'm struggling. Maybe it's a definitional thing that I'm struggling with. I'm not sure, but I guess I'm struggling with, how is even that thought, I need to be brave, how is that not a story based on the emotion you're experiencing, based on the feeling you're experiencing? Would any interpretation
anybody have
then
something
count
to
as a
say?
story?
Yeah, go ahead.
I do. I've had some. When it happens, you don't forget it. Like Danae, I don't think you're going to forget your realization. And for me, there have been a couple times where my ego is just stripped bare, where I think that I know who I am, that I care so much about this particular part that I perceive I'm good at, and then all of a sudden it's it's questioned, or and I've heard a teacher call it, it's like the rug being pulled out from under you and you're just for a second floating. And that experience, it's both tender because you're completely vulnerable, and tenacious because you have to be so brave to just float for a while.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is the part where you can test whether it's a storyline or not. Does it connect you to other people immediately? Connects you, as opposed to solidifying,
And separating.
getting into your cocoon, being defensive, coming up with justifications.
Mm-hmm.
So do you feel that tenderness and courage is actually helping you lean into other human beings and feel what you perceive, that there's this commonality? All of a sudden, you're like, oh, wow. You know, we're all sharing this doubt, because it is a doubt about what am I, where am I?
Mm-hmm.
That's just been my experience.
Thank you, Liz. And I'm guessing Danae has something to say.
Yes, thank you. I want to respond to you. And I think what happens in these sorts of moments is an opportunity to acknowledge and embrace. Okay? For example, when there was this insight about me needing to be brave, I could have gone in a variety of directions. It's like, oh, I'm not already brave? Do I have to be even braver? How do I do that? I thought I was brave last Tuesday when I did such and such for somebody, and where, you know what? He hasn't called me, and you know, you see where it's going. I mean, there's a way to begin to spin and to spin out with those types of I don't know, experiences or insights. Um, so so that's one thing. Place yourself in a position to be able to say, oh, okay.
That's that, yeah, it arose. So, and thank you, because you actually just reminded me, well, you did remind me that I wanted to say something about applied mindfulness training and Susan Piver. Applied mindfulness training is the organization presents a secular approach to meditation. I'm the executive director of that, and we just started programs with people. We started a podcast, and a gentleman named Michael Carroll, who's on our board, who has written a lot of books about mindfulness at work, is interviewing people. And the first episode that he interviewed of our podcast was Susan Piver. And yeah, Susan is really So yeah, I mean, I think it's one of those things that it's like if you keep practicing meditation, at some point you begin to realize, like me with my socks, you begin to realize that something is actually dropping you into a out story. You know, for a long time I had this story of heel, sole, toe. I'm supposed to be paying attention to my feet as they touch the ground. And then at some point it was just, there it is. And I said, oh, it's the socks. Okay.
I mean, I don't want to harp on this if everybody else is getting it, but I guess where I'm getting caught up is that anything that comes to my mind from within that is internal, to me fits to that definition of this is a story I have just told myself.
Okay, let me give
versus
you a
something that is externally coming into me.
Let me give you a different definition of story. How about
Okay.
that?
Yes,
The nature
thank
of mind is, you know, a lot of people have this mistaken idea that meditation is supposed to, your mind is supposed to get very still and you're going to be very peaceful and it's going to be this or that. That was the only thing I would have said about your lovely thing is that, yes, sometimes it does get very peaceful and it feels very good and it just naturally arises that way. Other times it's like crazy chaos. And meditation is very useful there too, because when that happens, you can either start to elaborate or you can simply let it be as it is. One of the examples, we are truly extraordinary evolutionary creatures, and the neocortex that enables us to create concepts, create and communicate about things that don't exist in the world at all, but we can share those ideas. The neocortex is one of our best assets, but it's run wild. It has taken most of us over, and it spins story after story after story because that's the nature of how we find meaning in the world. So in order to connect with something more real than the spun stories, we have to train our minds, tame our minds, and come to the point where we begin to tell the difference between when we're running with elaboration and when we're simply present. And one of the examples, and we're going to work with some of this on Saturday in the guided meditations, but one of the examples that I like to give is we usually have some beautiful flower arrangements in the room. And I will say, look at the flower. Just look. See if you can just look without any elaboration. And so you can look, and most people, you know, it's like, and then I say, watch what happens to your mind. Oh, that's a daisy. And oh, it looks like maybe that's a little wilted. You start to tell a story. There's a difference between the moment when you look, and yes, you may even have the thought flower arise, but you're not sort of telling yourself a story. And then you look and you say, oh, daisies, oh, I forgot to water my flowers today. You know, off you go into a story. So there's a difference between mind's tendency to engage with the world around us and with our own inner experience by giving things labels. We label because labeling makes things workable. It gives us a handle. But there's a difference between cranking that handle and simply recognizing, oh, there's that. Is that helpful? Okay, maybe. Yeah, you think about it. That's good. Yeah. Good. Did you want to say something? Well, except that we've got people on Zoom and they can't hear you without the mic, so.
Is that, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay. I think
sit here in a chair, listen, and pay attention. There's a confidence in that. So it's almost like an exercise, in my opinion. Muscle strength is done by practice. It's the same here to me. It's done by practice. The more that we attune to, and get silent, as our teacher has said tonight, that becomes stronger. And we're able to discern the diversity in our movements.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to retrieve the talk because our because I'm noticing the chat on Zoom that the microphone that people are not hearing, and so
Really hold it close to your mouth.
yeah. Well, that's okay. I mean, we're still working with this. Hopefully, it will get worked out at some point. But I want to just go ahead and finish what I wanted to say here tonight about this, because the dealing with reality properly and skillfully is when we're not afraid both to face what is, to look at what's going on, not what we tell ourselves. I mean, how often have we had the experience, all of us, I think, of having a reaction to something that occurred and later on finding out that that wasn't what happened at all? That it was something else entirely, but we had a whole story. The traditional Buddhist example of this is walking into a darkened room and seeing something coiled up in the corner and thinking it's a snake and completely panicking, and then it turns out that it's a coiled up rope. And so, you know, you had all this reaction and it was to something that didn't even exist. And so I think that it's for us to realize that for us to be open to messages from the phenomenal world, we have to be willing to actually drop our storyline, stop cherishing our opinions enough to have some idea what's really going on. And in our country right now, I've been thinking a lot about the challenges that face us right now, and they are formidable. And yet they are not any more formidable than challenges that have faced other people at other times. And in every situation that humanity has ever faced, some people rise to the challenge and some people don't. And so how, if we want to be one of the people who meets the moment with the quality that in Shambhala training we call warriorship, how is it that we can do that? And I think that the first step is what we talked about last week, which is that you have to explore your own personal, individual energy, because that's what tells you what you bring into situations. That's how you begin to realize your patterns, what you habitually tell yourself. All of us know somebody who habitually is the voice of doom. Really? I mean, don't we? And we probably also know somebody who's Pollyanna. You know, I just always look on the bright side of things. Both of those are filters that arise out of a person's particular compensatory energies, how they've learned to work in the world. So we have to unpack our compensatory mechanisms and see, what are we carrying? What colors, you know, when you're taking a picture, when a photographer's taking a picture, and sometimes nowadays that it's all digital, it's different, but in the old days, people would put different colored filters in front, and they get different effects in the photographs. And you could think of these relative reference points that we all have as each of us carries a unique set of filters, and those affect the way we see the world, the images, the photographs, the images we have of reality. So getting to know ourselves allows us to see the world more clearly. And then in order to embrace opportunity, that's interesting, I've been reading a little bit about Stoicism, and one of the stories that the guy tells in this book is that about, and I I really did believe that it was true. Actually, he didn't tell this story, but I started reading what he said about crisis and opportunity. So I want to say that the way we deal with this is that we embrace the opportunities that we face. And sometimes, so John Kennedy, when he was elected, actually, I think it started on the campaign trail, but he told this story about the Chinese character for crisis. And he said it was composed of 2 strokes, and one stroke meant danger, and the other stroke meant opportunity. And so I internalized that. And then, thanks to the internet, I discovered that that's not actually true. That's not really what the Chinese, so some expert who knows about how Mandarin works said, no, that's not actually true, but it's nice. And I think it's lived for so long because it's very comforting to us to think that crisis is an opportunity. And I would argue that the reason that that's comforting to us is because there's something to it. Some deep intuition that we have is that when things are challenging, we have an opportunity to meet the moment in some kind of skillful way that could bring benefit. And that's, I would suggest there are 2 things that would enable us to more fully embrace the opportunities that nowness brings to us. Nowness is a kind of a code word that we use for that state of being when you stop elaborating and you're just, here, just here. And there's some kind of openness, there's some kind of willingness to take in whatever is there. And then instead of habitual reaction, there's some kind of genuine responsiveness, freedom to respond in a way that brings benefit. And the 2 things, the 2 sort of practices, behavioral practices that we can undertake to help bring that about. One is stop seeking happiness. We go around trying, and we have this idea that if we just get all the ducks lined up right, we'll be happy. And our culture certainly encourages that perspective.
So does the Declaration of Independence.
Right, the pursuit of happiness. Right, the pursuit of happiness. You have a right to pursue happiness. Interestingly enough, I just recently read something about somebody doing an analysis, I guess, of the language back then, and that what was meant by happiness there was the ability to pursue your life's goals without interference. That it wasn't la la la, tra la la happiness. It was that you aren't being messed about, shall we say. So that's one thing. And then the other is to stop avoiding pain. And this was really interesting for me with the situation I was describing earlier last night. It was like I could feel the pain, and I was sitting there reading. I was trying to catch up on the New Yorker, and I was sitting there reading, and I was at my son's house because I'm shadowing him in preparation for babysitting my granddaughter, who's only 8 months old, so there's a whole routine that goes with that. But anyway, I was sitting there, and I could feel this very uncomfortable sensation that just, it was like, I don't want to feel this. I don't want to feel this. I'm going to read the New Yorker, And finally, I have practiced for a long, long time, so I know when I'm trying to avoid something, and I knew I was trying to avoid that, and it was like, okay, do you think it's going to go away if you try to avoid it, or what? And so I actually ended up, took a little while for me to surrender, but I ended up going and sitting on my cushion for a while and just going, okay, what is it? Let me just, let me feel it, whatever it is. And in those moments when we are willing to open to pain, stop avoiding the pain and be willing to be there with it, we invite what in the traditional Vajrayana Buddhist teachings they call the inner guru, or we could call that small, still voice that wakes up within us. If we stay busy and we hold on to our opinions and we're chasing happiness and trying to avoid pain, then we don't give that inner wisdom a chance. So what you said, Chris, about what you told your friend about trying to find that within, that's exactly what we're talking about here. And you can be a Buddhist or a Christian or an agnostic or anything you want to be, and you can still find that if you are willing to pay attention to your experience, to train your mind, to boycott your cherished opinions and storylines, and simply be willing to face reality. So it's a constant learning process. I don't think it ever stops. I keep waiting for that, great flash when everything makes sense and I stop being upset about things. But it does become more workable. And I think that's the main thing that however much time I've got left on this planet, the song I'm singing is, hey people, your minds are workable, but you have to work with them. That's it. That's it. If you don't work with them, they're not workable. Then you're just stuck. So I think that's, how are we doing? Oh, good. We've got a little time for discussion. I'm not sure whether Valerie's the only person left. Val, have you been able to hear the people on the mics?
Sometimes.
Sometimes. Okay. Well, if people, I'm going to invite questions, comments, and observations. If you would hold the mic as close to your mouth as you can and speak as loudly as you feel able to, that would be helpful. We're trying to work this out. So, yes, please.
Can you explain what you mean by the phenomenal world? I feel like that's been referenced a few times, but never defined.
Yes, the phenomenal world. So phenomena are what we experience, our perceptions, and actually, as science has told us, we don't actually experience external reality. We think we do, but our minds, our brains are have evolved to create an image and we filter out much more than we actually incorporate. But that image that we have of what arises in the world, whether it arises as, the famous rock that the philosopher kicked, or whether it arises as the emotion that charges up within us, all of that is part of the phenomenal world. Anything that is able to be experienced is part of it.
So you mentioned anxiety and have mentioned in the past conversations other mental health experiences that you've had. Would you say that that is part of the phenomenal world or one of the filters that we're putting over our mind? I guess I'm trying to just figure out where everything fits.
Yeah, you are, and that's good because that's how you sharpen your intelligence, your ability to discern things. Yes, that's really good. One of the tendencies that we have, one of our most tenacious habitual patterns, is the desire to compartmentalize our experience, to draw boundaries between this and that. And in fact, those boundaries, I just read today, and I can't remember which, maybe it was Niels Bohr, one of the really bright physicists of the last century, said, if you aren't completely freaked out by quantum physics, you don't understand it. And I think that what it is that freaks us out is that the quantum physics actually tells us that there is no solid reality, that there is no definitive, substantial, rock bottom thing, and that we can only, in fact, it is only in our perceiving of things that they solidify to the extent that they seem to. Which raises an interesting question. If we cultivate not solidifying, if we cultivate trying to be in that awareness that doesn't solidify, do we actually alter the reality that's around us? And that's one of the things when I talked about the undercurrents in our society and how it might make a difference if we don't get in there and, have a dog in the fight. We might actually be able to create an atmosphere in which things begin to soften. They did some experiments once. They got a bunch of people meditating. I think this happened in Washington, D.C., and I think it was transcendental meditation, but I wouldn't swear to any of this. However, they did do this where they got a bunch of people sitting in a room generating a sense of calmness and peace and settling, and the crime rate in that area actually went down by a statistically significant amount for that particular period of time, which I wouldn't, since I can't point you to the research, I won't belabor it, but my intuitive sense is that it makes a difference if we cultivate our willingness to embrace reality and try to bring benefit in the world. And in that sense, I don't think it really matters whether it's inside or outside, to speak to your question. Is it something inside? Is it something outside? Can we find the exact difference? When the Buddhists talk about perception, they talk about it as the ayatanas, and the ayatanas are a process, not a thing. It's not like I have an eye that sees a visual thing out there. There's a visual process or an auditory process. And the boundary, the closest Western philosophy got to that is if a tree falls in the forest and there's nobody to hear it, is there a sound? So I think that question is very valuable to explore. And what you said, when you said, I need to think about it, what I thought is she's going to contemplate this. And there's a difference between thinking and contemplating. And we're going to work with that on Saturday too. But our conceptual mind, which when it runs amok, causing us and other people an enormous amount of trouble, can be harnessed. And one of the ways that we can harness it is through contemplative practice, in which we invite our conceptual mind to mine our experience for insight. That's a lot to hand you at one time. Thank you for your questions. I really appreciate it.
Sure, yeah, sorry if I'm...
No, we're delighted to have you. Anybody else have anything? Yes, please.
I'll talk very loud. Does that work?
But they can't hear on the here if you don't put it on.
If it's green, it's on.
It's green.
Okay, good.
I just have a question. Can you talk more about sitting with the pain? What does that actually mean in practice?
What does that actually mean in practice?
Yeah, because you mentioned your example was good where you were feeling something and you just sat there with it.
Mm-hmm.
But when you just sit there with it, you're thinking about it. It's like, what does that mean?
Well, there's a
to
difference. There's a difference, and
sit
this is
there
one of the
and
things
feel
we'll do in the exercises on Saturday. There's a difference between thinking about it and feeling it. And there is a technique that a friend of mine introduced me to, which has been very helpful. It's called focusing. Anybody here know about focusing? So, years ago, Carl Rogers was teaching in Chicago, practicing. He's a humanistic psychologist, brilliant man, and a number of people who were around him, and they were frustrated by the fact that psychotherapy seemed so randomly successful, shall we say. And so they decided to do a study to see if they could figure out what qualities made for successful psychotherapy as opposed to people who could go into therapy for long periods of time and basically not change their patterns? What were the characteristics of people who became healthier and saner and progressed in therapy? And so the way they did this was they studied tapes over a long period of time of a number of different therapists and listened to their sessions with people. And then the ones who were successful, they actually went and interviewed and tried to discern what those people did that was different from the other people. And once they had done that, they categorized, which this is where conceptual mind can be very useful, into steps. So what is it? And the most fundamental thing is that those people were able to access what they came. So this man who came up with this, his name is Eugene Gendlin, and he called it the felt sense in your body. When you live in your head a lot, you don't feel your body. I mean, unless it starts hurting, and then you go, oh, I've got a pain in my shoulder or whatever it is. But as part of the contemplative discipline of uncovering our patterns, we can learn how to go in and find the parts of our body that have something to communicate with us. And we can invite that communication. We can invite that insight. And so that is not thinking, although you do use, thinking can be a tool that you use to do that. But it's not like sitting there thinking, oh, I'm so miserable and this is the situation that occurred that made me miserable and blah, 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 blah. You know, instead of that, you're actually going, where do I feel this? Where do I feel it in my body? And what does that feel like? Is there anything that it's like? So I invite you, there's a woman named Ann Weiser Cornell who wrote a book called The Power of Focusing that I found incredibly helpful in processing my own locked away stuff. But is that helpful? Good. Anybody else? Oh, okay, I couldn't tell it was you speaking because of your mask. I'm like, where's that voice coming from?
And actually, it's just to continue. So for me personally, my question is, what happens, you said, to face the pain? So what happens when we face the pain and it reveals something that we don't want to take on, or I don't want to take on? And then how is it that, because I've been trying to identify for the past 2 years, since I had a surgery, there's an infection somewhere in my body, and my white blood cell count is down to 1.8. It's steadily gone down. I've seen upwards of 50 doctors, and it can't be found. So how do we find what part of the body is actually speaking when it seems like there are many? And then when it reveals, what if I don't want to take it on?
Yeah.
Not because of fear, but because of exhaustion.
Well, that's a really wonderful question and probably far beyond my capabilities to give you a very good answer tonight. But what arises in my mind is that we have to respect our own limits. Usually when we have some part of us that wants to push on through, I mean, you know, there's a tendency to say, well, you just have to be brave, you know, but often that's some part of us that is harsh and is trying to compensate. So again, we come back to tenderness and tenacity. Tenderness is being gentle with yourself, actually having some warmth and friendliness toward yourself that here you are, and this is the situation for however long it goes on, however long you're in this body with all its autonomic processes working and with everything else that's going on. This is what you've got. And so some kind of tenderness toward that. And then tenacity, which another word for tenacity is patience. Yeah. And being willing to just stay and stay. I mean, for me, I know in my own journey, it took years before I could actually feel certain parts of my body that were actually holding the deepest, darkest things that I didn't want to face. And so it was like, okay, I can't go there yet. I can't go there yet, you know. But what can I do? I can be willing to stay with this that's here today. I can be willing to stay with this for a while. And I really did make, because when I recovered memories that I had been repressed for many, many years, and my children were still living at home. And it was such a dramatic, traumatic thing to recover those memories that I wondered if I was going to need to go into a hospital or something. I mean, you know, I started to feel really crazy. And then I realized, no, I've trained in working with my mind for many years. I should be able to do this, but I need to, I made a deal with myself. It was like, I will sit on my cushion for a certain amount of time each morning, and then I want to get up and act like a normal person so my kids feel like they've got a mother who, you know, who can function in the world. And it took years, literally years. But it slowly, I mean, what have we got? What else have you got to do, you know, except explore what you're here with and how to interface the world with that. So I'd say patience and friendliness to yourself, that's the best way to do it. Mhm. Anybody else? Yes, Beth.
Yeah, this kind of connects to different things we've been talking about. It's a personal story, but, you know, talk about sitting with pain or storylines versus being, you know, the thinking and use the word openness a lot. And I even before you were saying that, I was thinking a major facet a lot of times is that openness versus attachment to something.
Mm-hmm.
Versus being open to other things coming in and augmenting and faceting. But was thinking back to several years ago when my dad was dying, very sick, cancer, lived with it for a lot of years, and it gets kind of intense, and you know, got my mom there, and my sisters, and my little nephew, and when I'm dealing with that, I'm like, okay, what can I do? That's what I'm feeling like. That's how, as I'm moving in the world, is what can I do? How can I make this better for my mom? What do I need to get done today? I'm gonna not quite your project managing when your husband, but kind of, you know, like when it's crisis time, I'm like, okay, what can I do?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, but that's can often be a storyline in and of itself.
It can be.
It is. And so what I would do sometimes is just, and I tend to repress my emotions, known that since I was, you know, this high. I would sit on the cushion for the express purpose of allowing myself to feel
Mm-hmm.
whatever arose,
Mm-hmm.
and try to keep my mind away from those storylines. The storylines are, what can I do? Or I'm sitting there and I'm crying, because most of the times I've got to hold it together for the family, because so that they can have their space. I would push that. I didn't have to hold anything together. I would literally give myself very conscious permission not to, which I needed. Otherwise, I wasn't happening except in a very safe environment on the cushion. But even then, I get some heavy awareness when that's arising, storyline. It's like, all right, that was only 5 minutes that I cried. That's not long enough.
That's not long enough.
To accomplish my grief. So you can, you know, kind of tongue in cheek, but feel, see, be aware of those thoughts start to arise, even when you're sitting there just for the express purpose of feeling,
Right.
and just don't attach to them.
Right, right,
You know,
exactly.
yeah.
Exactly. There's an expression that Trungpa Rinpoche, my teacher, used frequently, which was, don't entertain the messenger. You know, you get the message, but you don't have to sort of, you know, it's like it arises and you just notice it, and you don't have to, as he put it, invite it in for tea and have a conversation. It's just what it is. That's the nature of mind. One thing after another, always, always. And the question is, how sticky are the thoughts? You know, and you start to notice, and I invite you, when you're practicing, when you're sitting on your cushion and you're coming back to your breath, to notice how sticky are your thoughts. Some days, boy, my thoughts are so sticky, it's like, you know, it reminds me of trying to get gum out of my daughter's hair. You know, just not happening today. It's not happening. But other days, it's just like, you know, what's that stuff called? WD-40. You know, just slips right away. And so it's the noticing. It's the noticing and the giving yourself the space to actually notice and stay with it. And yes, we do have, you know, that's, you actually raised a really interesting point, Beth, because I think that we tend to think of our tendencies, our coping mechanisms and all of that as being part of our ego. And it can be a way that we, you know, sort of try to prop ourselves up and distance ourselves. At the same time, our basic energies are what they are. And there is an awake and very beneficial aspect to those energies as well. So I was just thinking when you were telling that story, well, if I had a crisis, I'd want her in my side, you know? So, I mean, I think, yes, if you use it as a buffer, again, I think it's that connection of, does it connect you with the world or does it separate you from people? And if you use it as a way to keep your distance and keep your feelings under wrap, then that's probably something to sit down and look at. But if your natural expression of how to bring benefit in the world is to say, okay, what needs to happen next? The dishes, all of the above, that's right. Yes, exactly. Good, anybody else? No, everybody's gone. We don't need the microphone. Oh, we are recording. We do need the microphone. Because I actually saw somebody who signed off, said, I'm frustrated, but I will get the recording. So let's use the mic, okay.
Yeah, I think there's a tendency sometimes to try to avoid stories. Stories are bad, you know, so we repress them and we can't, oh no, I'm a bad Buddhist as I keep having storylines, you know, and that sort of thing. And it's really, as you were just saying, it's just the opposite. Inquiry is really important, and what we can notice is really important. And just one little thing that I often do when I feel confronted with storylines is, okay, is this taking me into the past? Is this taking me into hopes for the future or fears for the future? Mm-hmm. And is there judgment? Mm-hmm. And if any of those answers are yes, then those are stories, obviously, and I can go down the rabbit hole and add to them. Mm-hmm. But also it gives me the opportunity to say, oh, wow, I'm really stuck in the past on mm-hmm. this thing. Mm-hmm. And that's probably going to take some more investigation. And yes. So, you know, being able to work with stories in that way becomes absolutely very beneficial. Absolutely. And as I think I said the first night, human beings are meaning-making creatures. That's what we do. And the way we make meaning is with stories. So it's not that stories are toxic. Stories are how we make meaning out of the world, how our brain takes in all these perceptions and we organize them in some way that allows us to engage in the world. And when that capability
diminishes, whether through dementia or other problems, then we stop being able to engage in the world. The stories, so the stories are very valuable. The trick is not to get solid behind our stories, not to get stuck in them. And I think of it as rehashing and rehearsing. And those are the sort of, rehashing the past, rehearsing the future, and you start to realize you're not here at all, and the extra element that you brought to it of judgment, and then you're going, and that's bad and that's good. And, I think it was Shakespeare who said, nothing's good or bad, but thinking makes it so. So it's like we decide to label this particular thing good or bad, but we don't really know. From our limited perspective, from our relative reference point in a given moment, we may think that's terrible, and yet we don't know. There's that great Zen story about the farmer whose horse ran away. Does everybody know this story? I won't tell it if everybody knows it. I mean, so anyway, I'll give an abbreviated version of it and you'll get the point. The horse runs away. His neighbors say, oh, how terrible that your horse ran away. He says, maybe, maybe not. And then his son goes and gets the horse or something. Anyway, his son breaks a leg. Everybody says, his son goes and finds the horse. Everybody says, oh, how wonderful. He says, maybe, maybe not. Then his son falls off the horse and breaks a leg. Oh, how terrible. Maybe, maybe not. Then the king comes by with his army conscripting soldiers, and they don't take the son because he's got a broken leg. It's like we don't know where the end of the causes and conditions that we are in the middle of, where they will resolve themselves. We do not know. We cannot know. That is beyond mortal comprehension. What we can know is the moment that we're in now. And the more that we are able to relax and not solidify around our perspective, our particular point of view, the more likely we will be to see what will actually bring benefit in this moment, what's called for now. What can I do to be helpful? Thank you all for being here. Thankfully, the air conditioning didn't go off in this room, and I really appreciate it, and I look forward to seeing people on Saturday.